Okay, so I've made it all the way up to the mountains of central Greece. I'm up at the entrance to the Sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. Behind me, you can see down all the way to the sea. From this vantage point, you can see to the Corinthian Gulf. The valley below would have been pasture land in the past, not the olive orchard you see. On it would have grazed the countless victims for sacrifices at this amazing sanctuary. This is easily one of my favorite sites in all of Greece. So I hope you enjoy. We're going to go and explore the Sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. So the Sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi is one of the most famous sanctuaries from the ancient Greek world, and for good reason. If you ever make it here, the setting is just splendid, set in the mountains of central Greece. The architecture is splendid, the remains, the museum, it's one of my favorite sites by far. I cannot get over it. This was thought to be the center of the world by the ancient Greeks, and it was a setting for oracles and for important games. People from all over the Greek world would come here to consult the oracle, the Pythia of Delphi, for her to foretell their future. As well, every 4 years, the Pythian Games were hosted, drawing in pilgrims and competitors from all over to watch musical festivals and athletic competitions. Now, I first want to give a little bit of context. There's several different types of sanctuaries in ancient Greece. The more prominent one, some of the largest sanctuaries, are considered Pan-Hellenic, and that includes Delphi, Isthmia, Nemea, and Olympia. These sanctuaries drew people from all over Greece to come to them for a variety of reasons, and they also hosted games, typically on an every 4-year basis, alternating between the four. So every year there'd be a new competition. As well, there's urban sanctuaries. Most often these are located above the city in the Acropolis, such as the Athenian Acropolis, but there could also be sanctuaries elsewhere within the city, like in the downtown Agora area. And then there's also rural sanctuaries. Some of these might service a variety of smaller communities in a region, while others could be connected to a larger city-state. I have photoed here at the bottom the Sanctuary of Eleusis, Sanctuary of Demeter, and the rituals at this sanctuary showed a strong connection to nearby Athens. For example, a group of the new initiates would march in a procession every year from Eleusis to Athens, helping show the connection between these two places. So when we think about sanctuaries, there's really mainly two key components. One is the altar and the other is the Temenos. So the Temenos is the wall that circles or encloses the sacred space. On the planet Delphi, you can see that obviously the sanctuary is quite complicated, but it has a clear wall delimiting the sacred area from the not sacred area outside. The second key component is an altar. And so early Greek altars were actually just made out of ash. The reason why is altars are where you make sacrifice. However, much later altars were monumental and out of stone, or they could be smaller and out of marble. There's a wide variety of these. And that's really all you need to make a Greek sanctuary. The simplest of them just have these two components. Though, of course, as we can see at the plan on the right of Delphi, the largest sanctuaries had a multivaried diversity set of components to them. Now, most sanctuaries had a temple, though not all, and these faced usually to the east and upon an altar. We can see here the altar in front of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. And so what happens at the altar is sacrificial ritual. This is where the animals are slaughtered, and then offerings are burned for the gods, and then a huge feast happens. Everybody who's gathered gets a portion of meat to celebrate in honor of the deity that's being sacrificed towards, or the hero even. And we can see that all roads kind of lead to the altar. Let me go back a quick slide or two. The road coming into Delphi, you can see it starts at the bottom right, and it leads right up to the altar. And at the same time, right outside the temple, you walk down the ramp and you hit the altar. So all roads really do lead to this altar. This is the central ritual focal point in Greek sanctuaries, and it was the center of the most important ritual, which was ancient sacrifice. At Delphi, we know that sacrifice happened since before any of the other accoutrements were built, well before there was any temple. We have early examples of sort of animal figurines, probably representing some of them sacrificial offerings, as well as later animal figurines in bronze, both pictured below. Now, sacrificial ritual we know from a variety of sources. One of them is ancient texts. So, for example, in Homer's Odyssey, at the site of Pylos, they mention how they slaughter the victim, and then they cut out the thigh bones, all according to due order, and wrap them in fat, making a double fold, and laid shreds of flesh upon them. And then these are then burned. And once the thigh pieces have been burned, then they taste the vital organs. They cut all the remainder into pieces, and they spit them, and roast all carefully, and took off the pieces. So a certain portion of the victim is offered up to the gods, burned, typically the thigh bones, and then the rest are consumed by the practitioners that have gathered together. And archaeology confirms this picture. Most sanctuaries show that thighs and sometimes tails, sort of the hindquarter or butt of the animal, are the parts that are burned. There's some interesting patterns to this, but I don't have time to go into all my research. But I can show you that the tail is very common in iconography. The tail curls when you put it in the fire, and so it's a sign of good luck. Of course, this always happens. As the tail loses moisture due to the flames, it contracts, and so it curls. But therefore, you can see how a sacrifice could always be a sign of good luck for those that have gathered. Now, this type of sacrificial ritual is a sign of continuity in the Greek world from the late Bronze Age through the Roman period. From the earliest ash altar at Lycaon in the Peloponnese, we see thigh bones being burned. And this continues all the way down to the well-known historical sanctuaries. And so the religious continuity is something we see a lot of from the late Bronze Age into the historical period. The same thing is true for several of the gods. Many of the god names that we know of from historical Greece are also known from linear B tablets in the late Bronze Age. So let's think through how to puzzle out Greek temples. So we have right here the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. This is what's left. It's not a whole lot. We have a few columns standing, you can see. We have some foundations. We have some architectural fragments lying around. You can see at the bottom some column drums. And you can even see the indentation in the center. That's where the dowels will be placed to be able to affix one drum upon the other to build up the column. So how do scholars actually take this sort of minimal picture of a temple and turn it into reconstructions like these? They can piece together the entire two-dimensional overhead layout of a temple. They can actually put it together in 3D even, going up and being able to understand how it was decorated and how it was put together. So what do scholars use to be able to create these? Well, first of all, we use Comparanda. There's hundreds of temples from the Greek world, many of them better preserved than the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, many worse preserved. But for example, we have some fairly complete ones, like this Temple of Concord at Archaeology. And so these complete ones help us understand the less complete ones because we understand that Greek architects followed certain standards. And this standardization was obviously useful for them to overcome the engineering difficulties of creating a large temple. And at the same time, it's very useful for us because it helps us reconstruct monuments from fragmentary remains. So typical Greek temples oftentimes look like this. They have a peristyle, a colonnade in a sense, or peripteral, going around it. And then they have a sort of tripartite rectangular structure. Some scholars argue this actually builds out of the megaron from the Bronze Age. I have no horse in that race, but it's certainly plausible. And there's other arguments that it builds out of large early Iron Age houses like the one that we've seen at Lefkandi. But these three rooms consist of a front porch or opisthodomos, a back porch or well, I mixed those up, but whatever. The front and back porch, and then the main structure in the middle, the cella, the naos. And so these are very, very common in almost all the Greek temples that we have. So when we look at the foundations at Delphi, we actually have what we need to be able to put this together. One second, I want to go back a couple slides. I always forget things. So what's interesting is we can tell that there's a certain proportion of the number of columns that exist oftentimes in the long ends and then the short ends of the temples. And it comes to a ratio of x equals 2x plus 1. And so you can see this here at Archaeology. Delphi also follows this, and what we can use are the columns that we know and the spacing that we have and be able to transfer that out to the entire temple. We have a few column bases circling it to help us test our calculations, and that's how we can put together the outer peripteral colonnade. As well, you can see that we have the foundations. So the left arrow was a column base, but the center and right arrow point out some foundations that we can see of this inner structure. And there's clues. If you get up close, you can see all the walls that are shown in the plan below. And so it's these traces of foundations that help us from column bases to walls to be able to put together this kind of two-dimensional layout of a temple such as that of Apollo at Delphi. As well, when we look at it in the vertical, we understand that there's three different types of orders that Greek architects use. They're known as the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian order. And these are not things that modern scholars have made up. We actually have a Roman architect, Vitruvius, who wrote about these orders in extensive detail, describing how they were constructed, how they even evolved. For example, he argues the Doric order is fossilized wood, or petrified wood. We know that they're made out of actual stone, of course, but there are certain components that seem like wood. Do you see the Doric order? There's the triglyph at the top. That's very reminiscent of, say, a wooden beam. This type of impression where you're trying to make a monument in one medium, in this case stone, that is similar to that of another medium is known as skeuomorphism. And you can see this in all kinds of Greek art. From ceramics that imitate basketry to other ceramics that imitate metal to here we have stone architecture imitating wooden architecture. And so Vitruvius described in detail the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian order. And it's not too hard to be able to see the architectural remnants of a temple and see which one they are. So take a look at the picture of the columns from the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Try to figure out which one it is. Maybe pause it, and then if you come back, you can tell that this is obviously Doric. The column capital resembles more closely the abacus that we see at the top of the Doric columns, and not much like the volute that we see in the Ionic or the different designs we see on the Corinthian order. As well, we can see that this column narrows as it goes up. This is called entasis, and it's very prominent in the Doric order. And so we now have a clear idea of understanding this temple. It's a Doric temple, which helps us limit our comparanda that we look at. As well, of course, we have a variety of architectural elements just lying around. For example, I'm there. You can see the scale, the size of this triglyph, what would lie up top. And we also have more bare metapiece blocks that could have been painted potentially. And so it's with all these different pieces and understanding where they would slot in, because we understand the engineering and architectural principles of the ancient Greeks, that we can actually put together a nice reconstruction. As well, we have some of the sculptures. For example, the pediment is this triangular section. It oftentimes shows sculpture in ancient Greek temples, and it's where freestanding sculpture can sit. It's at the very top, right below the roof and above the colonnade. And so what we can see here is how the pieces match up to identifications that we have gotten from descriptions from ancient historical authors. People like Pausanias have come and visited the site and described parts of the temple and parts of other architecture, and we can link up the fragments we have to be able to put together the larger scene. And so it's through all these pieces of evidence, from comparanda to historical references to using your intuition and taking careful measurements, that we can actually create these plans, both in all three dimensions, to be able to reconstruct a temple such as this at Apollo, or at Delphi. As well, we can understand what goes on inside the temple. We have some finds that relate to historical descriptions, such as what we're fairly sure this is the golden ivory or Chryselephantine statue of Apollo. It might be a different statue, but this is the best running guess scholars have. And you can see the ivory features of the face and his feet down at the bottom, and then some of the gold features that would have shown forth, in a sense, to anyone visiting. As well, we have this Omphalos, literally the belly button. An ancient myth at Delphi put that Delphi was at the center of the earth, and this was the belly button of the earth. And there's also several references that suggest there were vapors rising up out of a chasm through the Omphalos, and that this was what would give the Pythia, or the priestess, her oracular powers. And so we can see these kind of features very clearly in iconography of this temple. So for example, the one on the left from Stansbury O'Donnell, where you can see clearly the Doric column, you can see the Omphalos with the bronze tripod on top, clearly signifying that this is the Temple of Apollo, and probably on the interior is the statue of Apollo himself. On the right, we can see the only surviving representation of the Pythia, seated on a tripod. We can see her holding the laurel leaves, the signs of Apollo, and the Doric column right there to help give it a sense of place. And so we can put all these different clues together to have a richer understanding of what's going on. So let's take a look now at the larger sanctuary. And so you sort of enter from the bottom right, the entrance into the Temenos, and you actually wind your way up to the temple. This doesn't show up clearly, even in the 3D that Google Earth gives me. It doesn't show up quite clearly, but I have some photos that I've taken for you that give a sense of the 3D perspective. It's actually quite a vertical hike up from the Temenos up to the temple and then up to the structures even higher. You can even get a sense of the challenges that were faced. This temple was enormous. It was adorned with gold, with bronze, with marble. It was very heavy. And so it's a feat of landscape engineering to be able to terrace the entire sanctuary. You can see the enormous polygonal terrace wall that would have held the weight of this temple. And this is just an impressive engineering feat. And the entire landscape is organized in a series of terraces. And so you kind of wind your way up. That's why there's that switchback there. Those of you that have hiked through mountain roads know you make several switchbacks to go up. And so as you enter, you have a series of treasuries along either side. Different city-states dedicated large monuments as votive offerings to the god, perhaps to curry favor in oracular prophecies, of course. And on your way up at your first corner, you hit the Siphnian treasury. And you look on the eastern face, and it looks fairly bare because the entrance is on the west. But the sculpture here, especially the pediments at the top, at the bottom is the contest between Achilles and Memnon. But at the top is a struggle between Apollo and Heracles for the tripod. And so this is an early myth, and it shows that the Siphnians made a choice in their iconography to choose iconography that's appropriate to the setting. It shows one of the foundation myths for Apollo at Delphi and his power there. And this scene is well known from other Greek pieces of Greek art, this struggle between Heracles and Apollo over the tripod. And looking at the front of it, this reconstruction gives you maybe a better sense of what it could have looked like in the past. It would have popped with color. The chori, the Ionic frieze going around, one of the markings of the Ionic order is instead of having triglyphs and metopes, they have continuous friezes going around. We'll see several of these. And then the pediment at the top, these would have all been painted and colored. We have traces of paint on some of these pieces, and we can therefore give a sense of just how might see it as gaudy, and maybe the paint was not quite so bright. It's tough to tell, but it would have been much more colorful than the bare marble that we think of. And we also need to picture bronze and gold and silver all around. All the dedications people would have made in marble, bronze, silver, and more would have shone and glinted in the sun, giving a very awe-striking appearance to the entire sanctuary. It was stocked. So the Siphnian treasury was built by the city-state on the island of Siphnos in the Cyclades, so quite far away. And this is important. So we understand this historically. Herodotus, an early Greek historian, describes how the people at Siphnos discovered ore, gold and silver ore, and with that wealth, they constructed this treasury around 525 BC. And so there's a variety of treasuries all around this sanctuary, and they're built by city-states all over the Greek world, from Western Greece to Eastern Greece, from Northern Greece to Southern Greece. They all came to build these treasuries when they had a moment, when they had a piece of wealth. Perhaps in order to curry favor with the oracle, perhaps because the prophecies that the oracle made, they changed history. And so this was an extreme struggle. The Spartans and the Athenians, for example, struggled for ages over who could control this sanctuary. But in reality, it was controlled by all the Greeks, and all of them came in order to offer dedications, to offer sacrifice, and large political units like city-states built these treasuries. And they built them in a way that displayed their piety, of course, but also advertised their power and wealth. So as you turn the corner past the Siphnian treasury, excuse me, you hit the treasury of the Athenians, the Athenian treasury. And this is an impressive structure We know that it was built from the spoils of the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. So we're still talking in the Archaic period, and it's clearly a Doric structure. It's very similar to early temples, though it's slightly different. And we can see the triglyphs and the metopes at the top and the Doric columns. And the metopes, of course, give their sense that they're archaic. These metopes depict the myths of Theseus, and you can see his nice archaic smile there at the bottom right. And in front of the temple, right below, on the left here, on the south, the spoils of the victory of the Battle of Marathon were displayed as a sign of the power of the Athenians, after all. And if we turn back, it's actually what you'd see. As you turn the corner, it looks like a bare wall to us, but portrayed right there were all these spoils: the bronze armor, the shields, and more, the gold and treasure from the Persian emperor. And so this would have been a prominent site of wealth and power, and a memory as well of the military prowess of the Athenians after the Battle of Marathon. And as you wind your way up, you can see the efforts the Athenians took to be able to deck out this sanctuary, to display their power and curry favor with the oracle. For example, the Stoa of the Athenians, a little further up, it's so subtly positioned that if you see how the top of the column matches just exactly the bottom of the columns of the temple, it would have looked as if it was holding up the temple of Apollo itself. And so the Athenians were very clever at choosing their vantage points to build these monuments as one turns a corner, so you focus on the treasury, and then as you're coming up to the temple and your eyes are on it, your mouth is watering from the smell of the sacrificial barbecue, and there you see the Stoa of the Athenians basically holding up the temple of Apollo itself. And so it's this kind of visual appeal and playing with both the horizontal and the vertical layouts of the sanctuary that give us a sense of how these different city-states portrayed their power and their wealth by building these treasuries and a variety of other monuments here. Having a treasury, you could almost think of it as like having an embassy. Sort of, this would be a meeting point where all the Greeks would gather. And so having a fixed location to show off your wealth and your power, it gave you the ability to host parties and to show off in a sense. And so the Athenian influence doesn't stop there. It's very clear in the temple itself. An earlier version of the temple, the archaic version, was built by the Alcmaeonidae. It's an aristocratic family from Athens, and they used their wealth to actually finish the temple. That one was then knocked down by an earthquake, and the temple we have to see is from the 4th century BC. I think the earthquake was 387 BC. And while I don't think the Athenians actually funded the whole construction, several Athenian sculptors, Pausanias tells us how several Athenian sculptors were involved in the sculpture, and specifically the pedamental sculpture that you see. As well, Pausanias mentions the Athenians dedicated the shields from the spoils taken at the Battle of Marathon. And other city-states did similar, like the Aetolians dedicated the arms, supposed to be Gallic, behind and on the left. And so you get a sense of how different city-states leave their marks by dedicating votives, which then become owned, of course, by the sanctuary, but the story behind the dedication is there for all to see and all to recount. And this was largely due to the oracular power of the priestess. Like I said, the oracles given would decide the fate of nations and city-states, and so they all wanted to curry favor as best as they could. But that's not where this sanctuary stops. You can actually go higher than the temple. As you proceed up, you hit the theater. And the theater is just splendid. It is my favorite place in the entire sanctuary. This clearly has the best seats in the house. You can see the entire sanctuary below you. You'd see the temple, the Treasury of Athenians, the whole valley below and the mountains around, while you could, of course, focus down on the play or the musical festival that's going on below you. And most often, this would have been a musical festival. Every 4 years, the Pythian Festival was held here. And this started off as strictly a musical festival, with Apollo as one of the major deities for ancient music. He's often depicted as this image from Delphi shows with his lyre. And as a zooarchaeologist, I love the fact that you can make out the tortoise shell at the base of the lyre. We have some archaeological examples like the one on the right that show how these lyres were constructed out of a tortoise shell, kind of as the resonant part of this string instrument that gives the amplification and the sound going out. And the theater itself was designed according to Greek standards, carved out of the landscape, and it would have been proportioned so that even if you're in one of the cheap seats, you would have been able to hear the pluckings of the lyre for this important Pan-Hellenic competition that drew musicians from all over the Greek world. And later on, though, this festival was converted to include athletic contests to match the Pan-Hellenic games held at Olympia, Nemea, and Isthmia. And so if you wind your way up even higher, you hit the Stadion. And the Stadion is set up for running contests and probably for other contests as well, such as you could do a variety of contests within this sort of open area. And you can see the seats as well. So there you have it. This is one of my favorite sanctuaries. It's packed with everything you could imagine, from music to sports, from barbecue feasts to honor deities to the legends about how the Pythia was stoned off of geological vapors to foretell the future. And most importantly, the landscape is just breathtaking. I really hope everybody gets a chance to visit, and I hope this gives a sense of some of the best of what Greek sanctuaries can offer, because this is by far my favorite.